Edward IV is said to have seen his future queen for the first time beneath an oak tree, or so the legend goes. According to this account, Elizabeth Woodville waited there with her two sons, Thomas and Richard, for the young king, who was to pass along the path beside the fateful tree with his army. And so it supposedly happened. The king caught sight of the woman, then known as Lady Grey, whose beauty was already widely renowned. Edward could not resist her, but she refused him unless he married her. The young monarch complied, and in the eyes of many historians, sealed the fate of his own dynasty. Edward's eloquent biographer Charles Ross, for example, describes this as the first major blunder in the king's political career. However, the reality is not quite so simple. Welcome back to Lemmy History. This is episode 3 of 6 in my series, which is dedicated to the confrontation between Edward IV and Henry VI. As always in my series, all episodes can be understood independently of each other. The previous episodes are, of course, linked in the description. Before we can turn our attention to the new queen, however, we must consider the fate of the previous monarch. Margaret of Anjou was living in France with her son Edward, under the roof of her father, René. The new King Louis XI had originally promised her support in her efforts to restore her husband, Henry VI, to the English throne. Instead, however, he reached an agreement with the House of York. Margaret now had an opportunity to replace Louis with a monarch more sympathetic to her cause. In France, a rebel faction had formed calling itself the League of the Public Weal. Their goal was to depose Louis. Among its members were Margaret's father and brother, as well as the Duke of Brittany and Charles of Burgundy, who would inherit the ducal title from his father Philip a few years later. Margaret found herself drawn to the idea. She believed that the word of the French king could never be trusted. Moreover, a new plan had been forming in the Lancastrian camp, one that made the changing political landscape in France even more pressing. Edward of Westminster had now entered his teenage years and was nothing like his father. A Milanese embassy report from 1466 notes that the prince spoke only of war and beheading. Edward spent many hours each day enthusiastically training in the arts of combat. One of his instructors is said to have sighed and wished that the boy could show as much interest in studying law as he did in learning the craft of war. It was widely believed that Edward of Westminster would soon be far more capable than his father of leading the Lancastrian forces in battle. For that, however, he would need strong support from the European mainland. But then, two events occurred that changed everything. First, in 1464, the prince became so gravely ill that Margaret undertook a 46-mile or 74-kilometer pilgrimage to pray for his recovery. In 1467, he fell seriously ill again, probably from measles or smallpox. Support for him crumbled, as it was no longer certain he would live long enough to inherit the throne. Second, the rebellion failed to achieve its goal of overthrowing Louis. Although the insurgents managed to wrest some concessions from the French king, none of them concerned Margaret or her son. As a result, Henry VI remained the figurehead of the Lancastrian cause. During this period, he moved frequently through the borderlands between England and Scotland. No one knew exactly where he was. Margaret, however, received letters from him and was likely able to send letters in return. For the House of York, these developments were likely the best possible outcome. For the time being, there was no immediate threat from the deposed royal family. Edward IV believed that Henry was hiding in Scotland, possibly in a monastery. He now had the chance to devote himself to what many saw as the noblest duty of a king, securing his dynasty. This leads us back to the oak. It is said to have been a day in mid-April of 1464. In all likelihood, Edward did not arrive with the intention of getting married. Various matches had been considered for him over the course of his life. As a 3-year-old, for example, he was to be engaged to Madeline, a sister of Louis XI. In 1458, his name appeared in connection with a potential marriage to a daughter of the ruling house of Burgundy. In October of 1461, there was a proposal that Edward should marry Mademoiselle de Bourbon, a niece of the Duke of Burgundy. This was followed by the idea of linking Edward to the Scottish regent Mary of Guelders, which was quickly abandoned. From Castile came an offer to the English court suggesting that Edward marry the heir to the throne, Isabella. However, the English king rejected this, permanently antagonizing the Iberian ruler. Edward knew that he had to marry, but he seemed determined to delay that moment as long as possible. 3 theories are commonly offered to explain this, though none is entirely convincing. First, there may have been a secret marriage to Eleanor Butler. Robert Stillington would later testify to this. Second, Edward may simply have been unable to decide. He understood that the choice would ultimately be between Burgundy and France, and he wanted both as allies. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, negotiated on his behalf with the French, but Edward also remained in regular contact with Burgundy. Third, it is possible that he simply wished to enjoy his bachelorhood to the fullest. If we assume he used the prospect of marriage as a means to charm women into spending time with him, a publicly known marriage would have stripped him of this tactic. None of these explanations is entirely satisfactory. Stillington did not disclose the alleged connection to Eleanor Butler until 20 years later, and at a moment when the information carried the greatest possible political explosive power. Edward also appeared to have no hesitation in spontaneously choosing Elizabeth Woodville. He did not act with restraint on this matter. Even as a married man, he continued to enjoy the attentions of multiple women. As king, marriage did not mean he had to live monogamously. I believe Edward did not plan far in advance to marry Elizabeth Woodville, and that he may never have intended to make the secret marriage, held on May 1st, 1464, at Grafton Regis before 4 or 5 witnesses, public at all. But then, the monarch seems to have recognized that marrying Elizabeth could be the perfect match for him in its own way. We will explore this in more detail later in the video. For now, it is enough to note Elizabeth herself. She was unlike any woman Edward had ever encountered. She came to him as a supplicant, but refused his offer to become his lover. At one meeting before the wedding, even a dagger is said to have played a role, though whether this is true, and if so, who held it, remains a matter of debate. Elizabeth challenged him, in the best sense of the word. She said no to a man who rarely heard that word. She also understood politics. Elizabeth was entangled in a dispute with the relatives of her late husband, Sir John Grey, over lands meant for her sons. Grey had died fighting for the House of Lancaster at the Second Battle of St. Albans in 1461. Elizabeth had originally appealed to Edward's closest friend, William Hastings. His help came at a price. She had to either marry one of her sons to a female relative of Hastings or pay him 250 marks. Although she agreed to this deal, she bypassed Hastings and went directly to the king. This made it clear that the agreement with Edward's best friend was only her plan B. It also gave the monarch the opportunity to play the savior and to continue his policy of national reconciliation. The king wanted both. According to the sources, which are unanimous on this point, Elizabeth was well aware of her own appeal to men. Her cool, commanding eyes are frequently mentioned in this context. She presented herself as something Edward had to earn. Her plea was not, in her view, a matter between man and woman, but a petition from subject to sovereign. If he wanted her, he would have to pay a different price. Without question, Edward knew that he was pushing boundaries. I covered the wedding in detail in my video on the marriages of the York brothers, so I won't repeat all of that here. Instead, I recommend watching that video. And by the way, since YouTube has changed its algorithm, I'm now asking for likes and subscriptions here in the middle of the video, along with turning on the little bell icon so you don't miss any of my uploads. These things count now more than ever. In short, Edward was in Stony Stratford and told his companions he was going hunting alone, but in reality, he went to meet, marry, and consummate his marriage to Elizabeth. This cloak and dagger behavior could hardly have had any purpose other than to avoid the general outcry he expected once the public, and especially the nobility, learned of a bride so far beneath him on the social ladder. Her family was widely loathed by Yorkist loyalists, and no one knew that better than Edward himself, who, just 4 years earlier, had mocked and humiliated Elizabeth's imprisoned father in Calais. Though their relationship had since been repaired, Sir Richard Woodville had been a member of Edward's Privy Council since 1463. Having switched sides after Towton, the memory had not faded. Still, no one had forgotten that both Sir Richard and his eldest son, Anthony, had once fought against Edward. In truth, Elizabeth would not even have been considered a suitable bride for a duke, especially since the family had caused unrest among the political elite with a tangible scandal long before a King Edward IV was even imaginable. Elizabeth's mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, had originally been married to John, Duke of Bedford. He was one of the brothers of Henry V and served as regent in France for the underage Henry VI. After John's death, she married Richard Woodville, a man of the lower landed gentry, purely for love. He was, in truth, little more than a squire, knighted solely because of his wife in order to maintain appearances. Nothing more than a squire, Warwick is said to have etched in Calais. Today, we often refer to Elizabeth as the first English queen to come from the common people. This, however, is not entirely accurate. Her mother belonged to the high nobility and for a time was the second most important woman in the kingdom after Queen Margaret of Anjou. But through her paternal line, there was indeed a kernel of truth to the claim. Jacquetta and Richard had 17 children, 14 of whom survived into adulthood. Elizabeth was the eldest of them all. Her oldest surviving brother was Anthony, 3 to 4 years younger than she. He was roughly the same age as Edward, which may have contributed to the fast-growing friendship and trust between the two men. Anthony was also the only sibling in the family, besides Elizabeth herself, who was already married at the time of her secret wedding to the king. Even that had been close. Anthony married Elizabeth Scales in April of 1461 at the latest, and thus could be addressed as Lord Scales. She died in 1473, and Anthony never remarried. In other words, the new queen had 12 unmarried siblings. This fact would soon become significant because marrying one of the Woodville children now meant forging a direct connection to the royal family. The nobility found themselves confronted with a difficult choice: either marry beneath their rank to become kin to the king, or risk finding themselves in opposition to him. Edward revealed his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville in September of 1464 at a meeting of his Privy Council at Reading Abbey. The reaction among those present was sheer horror. The Burgundian chronicler Jean de Warren is not typically regarded as the most reliable source. Yet in this case, he seems to have accurately captured the mood of Edward's advisers. They answered that she was not his match, however good and however fair she might be, and he must know well that she was no wife for a prince such as himself. Edward was not impressed. He ordered that his new wife be brought to him immediately. On September the 29th, 1464, it was Warwick and Edward's brother George who escorted Elizabeth to the king. The notion that the so-called kingmaker, Richard Neville, opposed the new queen from the beginning is an invention of later centuries. While he was certainly no friend of the match, he was far more troubled by another detail. He had been kept entirely in the dark. John, Lord Wenlock, noted in a letter just days later that the monarch had kept the marriage very secret, even from his closest advisors. Warwick now understood that he did not have Edward's full confidence, and worse, the king was perfectly willing to humiliate him on the international stage. After all, Warwick had been in the middle of negotiations with France for Edward's hand. At the same time, Wenlock had been speaking to Burgundy about a similar proposal. The 22-year-old monarch had disavowed both men. Wenlock's private reaction to the fateful council meeting has come down to us in a remarkably candid remark: "We have to be patient, despite ourselves." For Warwick, it only got worse. Edward began aggressively marrying off Elizabeth's numerous siblings to members of the high nobility. He had decided that England's great families could choose whether to accept these unions or risk the consequences of refusing. The pressure was immense. Elizabeth's sister Catherine was married to Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, who at the time was only 9 years old. Warwick, who had just 2 daughters, had long hoped to secure similar matches for his own family and was now being passed over. He approached Edward with a proposal that one or even both of the king's brothers marry his daughters. Edward declined. Since Edward could no longer wed a foreign princess himself, he looked for suitable alliances for George and Richard. For his youngest brother Richard, he is said to have considered a French princess. In 1468, the Milanese ambassador to the court of Louis XI reported that the lady in question suffered from scoliosis, something she shared with her potential husband. But the most notorious of the Woodville marriages was yet to come. Elizabeth's brother John, just 20 years old, was married to Catherine Neville, who was around 65. The union became known to contemporaries as the devilish wedding. Notably, such age differences provoked little outrage when the roles were reversed. The nobility could see what was coming. The council's first action at Reading was therefore understandable. Its members scrambled to find a legal means of declaring Edward's marriage invalid. But they failed. The wedding was a fait accompli, as they were finally forced to acknowledge. From the beginning of Edward's reign, Robert Stillington had been a member of the council, present in his capacity as Lord Privy Seal. Based on his later statements, he could have spoken up then and eased the Baron's concerns. His silence can be interpreted 2 ways. Either Stillington deliberately concealed knowledge of a secret marriage to Eleanor Butler in order to avoid becoming Edward's enemy, because the chance of being hailed as a hero of the Lords was not enough to outweigh that risk. Or more simply, there was no prior marriage to Eleanor Butler, and Stillington had nothing to say. There has been speculation that Stillington could have dropped a quiet hint that Edward was already legally married. But Edward was no fool. If such a secret marriage to Eleanor did exist, Stillington would have been the only witness. It would not have required much detective work to identify the source. What matters most is this: Edward recognized Elizabeth as his wife and queen for the rest of his life, and as long as he lived, no one publicly questioned the validity of their marriage. Ricardians have often been tempted to deny the legitimacy of the union. John Ashdown Hill, for instance, pointedly titled his biography of Elizabeth Edwards chief mistress. But from a legal standpoint, this is incorrect. The Church also recognized the marriage as valid, and only the Church could have declared it invalid. Henry VIII, incidentally, may be consulted as an expert on that issue. That never happened. In short, while Edward lived, the validity of his marriage to Elizabeth was never questioned publicly. And even after his death, it was never legally annulled, not even by the Titulus Regius Statute of 1484. I will therefore continue to treat the marriage as valid. That said, the Woodvilles endured considerable hostility. They were accused of enriching themselves through royal patronage at the expense of the crown. To this day, the image of the greedy Woodvilles persists. Yet modern historical scholarship has revised this view. As Charles Ross has written, "Yet Edward did little to advance the material interests of the Queen's relatives. Certainly, with the partial exception of her father, they never enjoyed the lavish patronage in land, wardship, and profitable offices which had so benefited the Neville family and men like Hastings and Herbert in the early years of the reign." The only person said to have erupted directly at Edward over the wedding was his mother, Cecily. According to Thomas More, she berated her son for having sullied his kingship by marrying Elizabeth. A very dubious tradition even claims she threatened to publicly brand Edward as illegitimate. He resolved the family dispute swiftly by granting his mother the following title: Cecily, late wife of Richard, the rightful King of England. Back to reading. At the beginning of October 1464, John, Lord Wenlock, had the unenviable task of writing to King Louis of France. The French king had been expecting an English embassy to continue negotiations for an alliance, one that was to be cemented by Edward's marriage to a French princess. That possibility was now definitively off the table. Even so, Louis did not sever ties with Edward. He remained eager to maintain friendly relations with the English crown. Still, he reportedly received a letter from Warwick not long after the council at Reading, in which the Earl spoke of a break with Edward and hinted at promising developments to come. According to the Milanese ambassador, Louis believed that Neville would depose Edward and take the throne himself. The French king even referred to Warwick as the best and truest friend in the world. But the good news never arrived. Warwick, at least outwardly, calmed down. This may have had something to do with Elizabeth herself. She could not easily be blamed for her husband's actions. From the first day, she embraced her role as queen and fulfilled its expectations with dignity and competence, making a sharp contrast to Margaret of Anjou. The fact that she became pregnant soon after the marriage certainly helped matters. In short, Edward's marriage did not damage his standing with the French king. Louis had no reason to oppose him openly, especially as Edward's domestic enemies were now aligned with the Lancastrians. And Louis, for all his ambitions, was in no position to challenge the English monarch directly. Relations with Burgundy were far more delicate. Through her mother, Elizabeth Woodville had distant ties to the Burgundian ruling house. Jacques of Luxembourg, the Queen's uncle, was often invited to represent Burgundy at official occasions. Still, these familial links were far too weak to serve as a meaningful foundation for an alliance. At the time, tensions between Edward and Duke Philip of Burgundy were running high. England exported significantly more goods to Burgundy than it imported. In retaliation, Philip had halted all imports of English textiles and ordered that any such goods found in his domain be confiscated. This embargo targeted a key English industry and threatened to cause serious damage to the realm's economy. English merchants were furious. They blamed Edward personally for the escalation, claiming he had delayed talks to renew the expiring trade treaty for far too long. They demanded decisive action and urged the king to retaliate by permanently banning all Burgundian imports. Edward hesitated for months. In early summer 1465, he finally responded. but not in the way his merchants had hoped. He issued a temporary embargo on Burgundian goods, stipulating that it would last only as long as he saw fit. More controversially, he reserved the right to issue import licenses. In effect, this allowed Edward to profit handsomely by selling access to the embargoed market. Given this tense economic standoff, it would have been diplomatically impossible for Edward to marry a high-ranking Burgundian noblewoman. In contrast, his choice of Elizabeth Woodville was far more practical. It allowed for informal lines of communication with the ducal court, without requiring a binding political alliance. A prime example of this softer diplomacy was the highly publicized tournament held in England between Anthony Woodville and Antoine, the bastard of Burgundy. It demonstrated that even amid political tensions, friendly relations could be maintained on the surface. In the end, Edward's marriage was not cause for any foreign power to re-evaluate its relationship with England. It created no serious diplomatic fallout abroad. But let us return to the matter of the marriage itself, an event that ultimately provoked resistance within England. There has long been speculation about why Edward chose to marry Elizabeth Woodville. Even during his lifetime, the prevailing explanation was simple: love and desire. Edward had a reputation as a womanizer, and the union was widely seen as a romantic impulse rather than a political calculation. Today, historians have proposed other motives. One recurring theme is the Woodville family's Lancastrian associations. While they were not part of the high Lancastrian nobility, they had nevertheless aligned with that side during the conflict. Marrying Elizabeth, therefore, allowed Edward to send a symbolic message of reconciliation, without raising suspicion that he himself was defecting to the enemy. This set her apart from figures like Eleanor Butler, daughter of John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, who was far more deeply rooted in the Lancastrian peerage. Elizabeth also came with other advantages. Her mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, was of the highest noble birth and had proven her fertility by producing a large number of surviving children. Elizabeth herself had already borne sons, an asset for any would-be queen. Edward IV, like most successful kings, relied heavily on men who owed everything to him. William Hastings and William Herbert were classic examples of such creations. The Woodvilles fit this mold perfectly. Edward knew that a foreign match was not feasible. Burgundy was off the table due to the ongoing trade war. France was in a state of unrest owing to the League of the Public Weal, and King Louis was known for his political volatility. He had even granted Margaret of Anjou and her son safe refuge in France. Meanwhile, the English public, scarred by the memory of Margaret, was deeply resistant to the idea of another French queen. Marrying Elizabeth thus allowed Edward to avoid offending either Burgundy or France. He still had his two brothers, George and Richard, available for foreign marriage alliances if needed. What likely happened is this: Edward never originally intended to make his marriage to Elizabeth public. Passion and affection may have led him to wed her in secret, but given her relatively low status, he could always plausibly deny the union if it became inconvenient. And given his reputation, most people would have believed him. Over time, however, Edward came to see that the Woodvilles were politically useful. They were wholly dependent on him and therefore unlikely to betray him. Elizabeth, moreover, had a vast number of siblings, ideal material for forging new marital alliances with the nobility. This would give Edward a way to pacify, or at least manage, the realm's great families. And since Elizabeth was already a widow, the usual scrutiny surrounding a noblewoman's virginity was irrelevant in her case. Edward was fully aware that his choice of wife would meet with fierce opposition, but he saw so many advantages that he ultimately chose to publicly acknowledge the marriage. At first glance, Elizabeth did not offend the political establishment to such a degree that open rebellion seemed likely. Meanwhile, she gave Edward the opportunity to build an entirely new network of relationships that would not have been available to him through traditional channels. Naturally, this did not mean the Woodvilles were free from controversy. Queen Elizabeth's mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, was particularly prone to it. In one notorious case, she is said to have orchestrated a prosecution for high treason against the former mayor of London, Sir Thomas Cook. His crime? Buying a luxurious wall hanging that Jacquetta had also wanted and not selling it to her for cheap. Her household reportedly ransacked his home, emptied his wine cellar, and made off with valuables. Though Cook was the actual victim, he was convicted, not of treason, but of a lesser charge. He was fined 8,000 marks, but the value of his stolen property, estimated at over 14,000 marks, was deducted from the total. In the end, he paid nothing at all. This infuriated Jacquetta, who persuaded Edward to dismiss his Chief Justice, Sir John Markham, for presiding over the trial. Edward had also pressured juries in the case, replacing several when they hesitated to indict Cook for treason. This was without doubt a disgraceful episode, but it was not uncommon for the time. More significantly, it showed that the judicial system retained a degree of autonomy, even when the Queen's family was involved. Edward clearly supported his in-laws, but his support had limits. He dismissed judges and tampered with juries, but when the final verdict fell short of what Jacquetta wanted, he allowed it to stand. In Edward IV's England, loyal subjects enjoyed a considerable degree of autonomy, but that autonomy always had its boundaries, whether one was Warwick, a Woodville, Cecily Neville, or one of the king's brothers. Richard understood this far better than George, but that is a subject for another day. Edward's marriage brought especially grim news for the House of Lancaster. Though the king had not secured a grand foreign alliance, neither had he made any powerful enemies. Domestically, his union with Elizabeth Woodville signaled that Edward IV was genuinely willing to extend trust to former Lancastrian supporters. And it was clear that this marriage would quickly produce heirs, further solidifying the Yorkist line. Meanwhile, Henry and Margaret's resources, financial, political, and human, were nearly exhausted. Henry, still a fugitive, spent more than one night sleeping under the stars. In later years, many stories would circulate about where he had been during the year he had disappeared from public view. But eventually, fortune abandoned him. On the 13th of July, 1465, Henry dined with a small group at the home of Sir Richard Tempest. Officially, he was merely a mysterious guest of high rank seeking shelter. In reality, Tempest likely knew full well whom he was hosting. It was a simple dinner. The group had only just begun eating when the calm was shattered. A sudden commotion, armed men storming the house. They were led by Richard's brother, John Tempest, and his brother-in-law, Thomas Talbot. What Henry and his party did not realize was that many more men had already been concealed within the walls of the house. According to Henry's pious biographer, the priest John Blackman, the king had foreseen his capture 2 weeks before it occurred. Whether this is true remains uncertain. So too does the identity of his betrayer. Some chronicles speak of a mysterious black-robed monk who approached Edward's agents. Today, suspicion often falls on Richard Tempest himself. Perhaps he hoped to make peace with the Yorkist regime. His family was indeed richly rewarded with lands soon afterward. In time, Richard Tempest would become a loyal supporter of Richard III. The raid was meant to take place while Henry's companions were distracted, but their vigilance proved formidable. Loyal to the end, they stood between the attackers and their king, buying precious time. Henry fled the house, but his escape was cut off at a river. There, he was finally captured. The fallen king was delivered to Warwick, who triumphantly paraded him through the streets of London, an unmistakable declaration that the House of Lancaster was finished. Edward IV chose to imprison Henry in the Tower. He likely balked at the idea of killing a king anointed by God. He also knew that Henry's son, Edward of Westminster, was cut from a very different cloth than his father. If he were to execute Henry of Windsor, as Yorkist sources now called him, he risked making the fiery young prince a rallying figure for the Lancastrian cause. Overall, Edward had every reason to be pleased. The royal treasury and his personal coffers were growing. His beautiful queen was pregnant. His deposed rival was in his custody, delivered by none other than Warwick. The apparent rupture between king and kingmaker, sparked by Edward's secret marriage, seemed to have healed. King Louis XI of France was eager for an alliance, and relations with Burgundy were gradually warming. Duke Philip's son, Charles, had convinced his father that France posed a far greater threat to Burgundy than England ever would. At home, the political temperature had warmed noticeably. But it was precisely the Queen's pregnancy that stirred fresh unrest. Until now, Edward's brother George had been the heir to the throne. If Elizabeth were to bear a son, George would lose that privileged status. He began to ask himself what role remained for him, and he was not alone in that concern. Warwick, too, was uneasy. He disliked the idea that he and his family now had to earn the king's favor. Edward's secret marriage had not only humiliated him publicly, but also proved that the king was prepared to ignore his counsel entirely. What's more, Edward seemed to value future loyalty over past service. There was no guarantee that Warwick would always remain the most powerful man in England. But Warwick, vain and proud, was not a man to accept demotion quietly. Thank you for watching. As always, please like and subscribe.